What is the most apposite or helpful cliche that you could deploy at a moment like this, I wonder? I've got one. Those who do not learn from history are condemned forever to repeat it. I don't know if it's watertight. I don't know if it covers all the bases all of the time. But my goodness me, it's fairly easy to understand at moments like this, isn't it? Because the shadow, the spectre of the Iraq war seems to me to loom large, not just over what is happening in Iran at the moment, Iraq's near neighbour, but also what is happening in Westminster and in political discourse. I've got two things written down on the piece of paper in front of me. That's it. That's the show. That's the... that's what passes for preparation on this programme. I've got the word Iraq and the word Trump written down in front of me, just in case I forget the key constituents of the conversation that I'm hoping to have with you. Iraq, because, obviously. And Trump also because, obviously. Those who do not learn from history are condemned forever to repeat it. It seems to me that the basis of supporting or not supporting the United States of America in another Middle Eastern adventure, and that's a question that you can't answer without referring back to Iraq. But it's not the question we should be asking. It's not about supporting the United States of America. The United States of America, led by Donald Trump, is not our historical ally. He would throw us under a bus as soon as have another cheeseburger. He just would. And of course, it doesn't matter, these sycophantic, self-styled patriots and sort of people who claim to be fans of strong men. The only thing they're drawn to about Donald Trump is the racism and the misogyny. Let's just be absolutely clear about that. He offers them nothing else except racism and misogyny. Whether you're writing a column for the Daily Mail about how you wish he was in charge here, or whether you're a voter in the United States of America, you've got a little bit more camouflage because you might have believed he'd bring down the cost of eggs or the price of petrol. But for the massive majority of people who seek to portray him as something other than a depraved delinquent, it's the racism and the misogyny with a fat side order of climate change denial, because that's where all the money can be made. And that's it. And that's it. So, should we be supporting the United States of America in another Middle Eastern war of highly dubious legality? That's a tough enough question to answer, and I think probably very hard to answer yes if your brain is working and you have any memory whatsoever of what happened in Iraq, what led up to Iraq, and what still unfolds in Iraq. And the question you should be asking instead is, should the British Prime Minister be unquestioningly following this US president into another almost certainly illegal adventure in the Middle East that has no plan? I mean, in many ways, and listen, stop me if you've heard this one before, in many ways, the deep and abiding and significant differences between the Iranian population and the Iraqi population notwithstanding, in many ways, this is an even madder prospect than Iraq. Because in Iraq, they at least pretended to have a plan, or they would have publicly acknowledged the necessity of having a plan. Somebody like Colin Powell, politically, I mean, to be honest, his words I never thought I'd say. Donald Trump makes George W. Bush look like Einstein. But there was at least a recognition that you should have had a plan. It emerged afterwards that there wasn't much of a plan. And that, of course, is why the Middle East descended into much worse chaos than it was in before American bombs and British people started landing in the country. But the idea expressed now by the White House and their closest allies that plans aren't our job. Plans are not our job. Aftermath is not our job. And I don't know whether it is the same old story about people not fully recognising the scale of change that Trump represents, talking about him as you might have talked about Ronald Reagan, although Ronald Reagan, of course, enacted laws that made it illegal to assassinate foreign leaders without congressional approval. Hey-ho, on we go. You don't talk about him in the way that you talked about Barack Obama or George Bush or his son, George W. Bush. He represents something completely different. He's entirely detached from either actual or a pretense of principle or morality. And this, the two things that I have been really sort of obsessing about since we last spoke are those two words written down on the piece of paper in front of me. Iraq and Trump. The essence of Trump, a hideous human being. Oh, how dare you say that? You've all got Trump derangement syndrome. That's what you say if you love the racism, the misogyny and the fat side order of climate change denial. He doesn't represent anything else. Now you're in the position of having to defend a US president who has launched more attacks on more countries than any other president in living memory, but who was elected on a promise to be peaceful. He was elected on a promise to put America first. He was elected on a promise not to take America into any more foreign wars or foreign engagements. And he's taken them into more than any other president in living memory. And yet you're still waving your flag. So you were waving your pathetic little flag when he was promising to be a president for peace. And you're still waving your pathetic little flag when he's actually turned out to be the most bellicose and warmongering president in living memory. Why? Because you love the racism, the misogyny, and the fat side order of climate change denial. And so many people on the thoughtful side of politics, on both sides of the Atlantic, are still a little bit frightened about stating it so plainly. Oh, we've got to give our full-throated support to Donald Trump. Why? You wouldn't trust him to babysit. Would you let him into your house to babysit for your children? No, but you're going to follow him into a war which has no legal justification. And then we come back to Iraq. That's all we're going to do today, isn't it? I suspect. Although I have got another question. I should probably write that down, which is the quote I referenced many times yesterday from David Petraeus, who sort of led that so-called surge in Iraq when they turned things around somewhat back in Gulf War II. Tell me how this ends. That might be the question that I ask you. Tell me how this ends. Simon Mars will join us later to talk us through what Marco Rubio has let slip. This sort of character, this whole cast of clowns that surround Donald Trump. Marcus Rubio has let slip that they essentially went in to attack Iran because they wanted to make sure that Iran didn't attack them after Israel went off the leash and attacked Iran without necessarily having got clearance. Well, you can hear it. We'll wait for Simon to have a look at that. It is coming up on the programme later today. And then you look at Iraq and you remember what happened. I was not really doing this for a living when the Iraq war happened. I wasn't paying as much attention to things as I should have done. I think I was just off the showbiz beat. I don't think I was. Was I here? If I was still very wet behind the ears and very much a seagull following the trawler of UK media. We were playing Beat the Sweet on the programme and things like that. It's an extraordinary 20-year evolution. I hope largely for the better. The listening figures would suggest so. But what I mean is, I used to be, and in some days, and in some ways I still am, one of those people who feels in this profession, oh, I'm going to pick a side and then I'm going to furiously defend it. I'm going to check my scarf. Oh, I've got this coloured scarf on, therefore I must be in favour of bombing a Middle Eastern country. Because I was last time. I've never met a war I didn't like, these people often seem to say. And I cannot quite yet, and I'm going to ask for your help with this, I cannot quite yet understand how anybody can be contemplating or assembling any opinion, any meaningful opinion about Iran that doesn't feature quite heavily Iraq. I just can't. Have a listen to what Keir Starmer had to say in the House of Commons yesterday, because you might not know it yet. The phone-in is going to be about what he's done and what he's decided, and this is what he said yesterday.
Mr. Speaker, we all remember the mistakes of Iraq, and we have learned those lessons. Any UK actions must always have a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. I say again, we were not involved in the initial strikes on Iran, and we will not join offensive action now.
So I've written down a few more things. Lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. How can this be controversial? How can it be controversial? having been involved in Iraq, and he's a Labour leader, albeit he wasn't in politics at the time, the legacy of that engagement has completely polluted the memories of Tony Blair's premiership, which did many, many good things, and sometimes, of course, by nature of being a supposedly leftish Prime Minister, he will always be pilloried with the negatives to the exclusion of all positives by the kind of people who pretend that Boris Johnson was more sinned against than sinning. But how can anybody with even a cursory memory of what happened in Iraq object to the idea that this time, as a bellicose American president, I love that word, you've probably noticed, a bellicose American president set sights on a Middle Eastern dictatorship that treats its own population with contempt, with murderous contempt? How can anybody contemplate the question of whether the UK should be in lockstep with that president without remembering the lessons of Iraq? Am I going mad? I look at the front pages of UK newspapers today, all of which were absolutely baying for blood in the run-up to the Iraq war. In action this day, PM won't hit Iran back. So that's the Sun newspaper. The Times manages to be a little bit more measured. Big strike coming, say US. And then things start going truly bonkers. The front page of the Daily Telegraph quotes the American president saying, "I am very disappointed in Keir." Okay. The Daily Express, which still technically qualifies as a newspaper, but only just. "Trump is very disappointed in Sir Keir over Iran help." Daily Mirror, accurately reporting what's happening in Iran, chaos and fear. The Guardian, accurately reporting what's happening in the Middle East. Fears grow as Iran conflict spreads across Middle East. And then, of course, the mothership of madness in this country. US lambasts hand-wringing, pearl-clutching Starmer as Kemi, oh, bless her, says he's scared of his own voters. Kemi Badenoch claiming that Keir Starmer is motivated by fear of Muslim voters' response, which means she either doesn't understand the difference between Sunni and Shia, she doesn't understand the entire history of modern Islam, or she's pretending not to. And I, for one, don't think she's pretending. If it's a choice between is she thick as mince or is she pretending to be as thick as mince, I now come down on the she's as thick as mince on every single occasion. Farage, as I will demonstrate to you lately, bases his opinion on whether American presidents should go to war against Iran entirely on what colour the American president is. If he's black, it's a very, very bad idea. If he's bright orange, it's the best idea since sliced bread. And I can prove that to you later in the programme. Listen again to our Prime Minister. And listen, if you are relatively new to this programme or you haven't been tuning in a lot lately, I'm getting quite a lot of jip at the minute for being quite critical of Keir Starmer, for pointing out that he's doing a lot of things badly. In fact, in a beautiful reminder of why I'm not on Twitter anymore, I put a little post up on Blue Sky yesterday that was praising him for this, and indeed for correctly describing what Donald Trump is doing, trying to effect regime change from the skies, and why the UK doesn't want to be involved in that. And I said very innocuously, why is he so good at this stuff and so bad at so much else? And of course my replies immediately filled up with people insisting that he was actually bad at everything, and people who were insisting that he was actually good at everything, with no room between the two. And that's the point, really, isn't it? It's that you either knot a scarf around your neck so tightly that it cuts off the flow of blood to your head, or you allow your brain to keep functioning. And if your brain is functioning today, how on God's green earth can you not be thinking about Iraq?
Mr. Speaker, we all remember the mistakes of Iraq, and we have learned those lessons. Any UK actions must always have a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. I say again, we were not involved in the initial strikes on Iran, and we will not join offensive action now.
So the UK media, and it's at odds with the UK public, although they sort of managed opinion on that in the case of the Iraq war, on the right of UK politics is united in the view that you do not need a viable, thought-through plan or a lawful basis to go to war. I'm going to say that again because sometimes I don't really appreciate the scale of what we're contemplating together until I actually get on air and start saying out loud what's been bubbling away in my brain all morning. The Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Express, your favourite broadcasters from various outlets are all now of the view, and they all told you Iraq would be brilliant, and they're now all telling you that we should do exactly what we did in Iraq and Iran, give or take a few statistical details, and that we do not need a lawful basis to do it or a viable thought-through plan to kick things off. What on earth is going on? You need to be quite... I don't think arrogant is the right word, although I have my moments. But it's a scary thing to do this sometimes, when I have the privilege of sitting down with you in the morning and looking at what everybody else is doing and thinking they've all gone mad. But we did it with Brexit, we did it with Donald Trump, we did it with Liz Truss, we did it with austerity. We looked at what was going on, we looked at the evidence of our eyes and ears, and we concluded that they'd all gone bloody mad. Let's do in Iran. Wow, they're completely different places. Iran and Iraq, one ends with an N and one ends with a Q. Incredible, right? And so Keir Starmer, who's getting it in the neck from one lot for not doing enough to support Donald Trump, a depraved lunatic, that's not an opinion, that's counting, and he's getting it in the neck from the other lot for going too far and supporting Donald Trump, while in reality he has walked a tightrope of unimaginable complexity. And he's done it really, really well. And do you know why? Because he's a lawyer. He gets this stuff. I don't think he's a very good politician, and I will take a lot of persuading from that position. But I don't think he's a very good politician on the current evidence, but he's clearly a very good lawyer. He's a very good interpreter of international law. But even if you don't agree, how can you have allowed yourself, and it's not a majority of the UK public. I've got the latest polling, and it's 49% against strikes on Iran. The US strikes on Iran. It's not a question about the position Starmer has adopted, and only 28% in favour. But that means 28% of Britons. What an interesting figure 28% is, eh? Whew. Anyway, 28% of Britons don't think that you need a lawful basis or a viable thought-through plan before you start bombing civilians in the Middle East. I'll say that again. 28% of Britons do not think you need a lawful basis to bomb children in the Middle East or a viable thought-through plan about how the engagement will be both executed and concluded. And you are living in a country where we're about to embark upon a ludicrous and all too familiar media-led discourse designed to bring us round to supporting the almost identical madness to what we were all persuaded to support back in 2003. Don't at me to tell me that you didn't support it. I fully appreciate that. And yes, you were right and everyone else was wrong. But why on earth would anybody want to do it again? Why on earth would anybody want to do it again? 21 minutes after 10 is the time. So you can't stop America. America couldn't stop Israel. This is what Marco Rubio made clear yesterday. This is only bloody happening because America can't control Benjamin Netanyahu. You can't stop America. You can't stop Benjamin Netanyahu. You can't stop James O'Brien talking, judging by Eleanor's face and the way that she just gesticulated at her watch. But you can stop Britain being involved again in a ludicrous, illegal, immoral, and ultimately incredibly dangerous engagement in the Middle East. So who the hell can possibly have a problem with what Keir Starmer has done?
So I just listened to James O'Brien's monologue on the Iran situation, and I need to talk about it because he said something at the start that I think should be tattooed on the forehead of every politician and newspaper editor in this country. Those who do not learn from history are condemned forever to repeat it. And I know that's a cliche. He even acknowledges it's a cliche. But the reason cliches become cliches is because they keep being proven right. And right now, watching the UK media and political class try to pressure Keir Starmer into following Donald Trump into another Middle Eastern catastrophe, I feel like I'm watching a rerun of a show I've already seen, except this time the picture quality is worse and the ending is going to be uglier. Let me give you some context here, because I think what James nails and what a lot of people are missing is that there are really two separate conversations happening simultaneously, and they keep getting collapsed into one. The first conversation is about whether the Iranian regime was evil. Yes, obviously. Khamenei was a brutal dictator who shot thousands of his own protesters, executed dissidents, oppressed women, and funded proxy wars across the entire Middle East. Nobody serious is mourning this man. That conversation is straightforward. The second conversation is whether the UK should follow the United States into an illegal military operation with no plan, no legal basis, no congressional approval, and no exit strategy. And that conversation requires you to remember what happened in 2003, because everything about this looks like Iraq with a fresh coat of paint and somehow worse planning. Now, here's what makes this particular moment so insane. Starmer stood up in the House of Commons and said something that should not be remotely controversial. He said, "We all remember the mistakes of Iraq. We have learned those lessons. Any UK actions must have a lawful basis and a viable thought-through plan, and we will not join offensive action." That's it. That is what he said. And the right-wing media in this country has lost its collective mind over it. The Daily Mail is running headlines about hand-wringing, pearl-clutching Starmer. The Daily Telegraph is leading with Trump saying he's very disappointed in Keir. The Daily Express is running essentially the same story. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, says she stands with our allies in the US and Israel. And Nigel Farage, as James O'Brien points out, has conveniently reversed his position on bombing Iran, based entirely on the skin colour of the president ordering the bombing. When Obama was in office, intervention was dangerous and reckless. When Trump does it, suddenly it's patriotic duty. But let me tell you what's actually happened here, because the timeline matters. Starmer initially refused to let the US use British bases for offensive strikes. He consulted government lawyers who advised that the US and Israeli operation did not meet the legal definition of self-defense under the UN Charter. He said no to Diego Garcia. He said no to RAF Fairford, and Trump publicly attacked him for it, saying in an interview with The Telegraph that he was very disappointed in Keir and that it sounds like he was worried about the legality. Now think about that quote for a second. It sounds like he was worried about the legality. Trump says that as if being concerned about whether a war is legal is some kind of character flaw, as if checking with your lawyers before bombing a sovereign nation is weakness. And that tells you everything about the person the UK right wing wants us to follow into this. Now, what happened next is where it gets complicated and where I actually have some criticism of Starmer. Because Iran retaliated, missiles hit Gulf states, airports got damaged, hotels where British citizens are staying got hit. An Iranian drone struck RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, and suddenly there are 300,000 British nationals in the region at risk. So Starmer shifted. He allowed the US to use British bases strictly for defensive operations, intercepting Iranian missiles and drones that threaten British lives and allied nations. British jets are now flying defensive missions, and he's framed this very carefully around collective self-defense under international law, not joining the offensive campaign. France and Germany have taken a similar position. Now, is that line going to hold? Honestly, I don't know. And that's what worries me, because this is exactly how mission creep works. This is exactly how Iraq started. You begin with a limited defensive posture. You're just protecting allies. You're just enforcing a no-fly zone. And before you know it, you're a decade deep in a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and destabilized an entire region for a generation. James O'Brien makes the point that at least with Iraq, they pretended to have a plan. Colin Powell, for all his flaws, at least publicly acknowledged the necessity of having a strategy. With Trump, the White House has explicitly said that plans and aftermath are not our job. They're not even pretending anymore. And the polling backs all of this up. A YouGov poll found 58% of Britons oppose allowing the US to launch strikes from UK bases. Only 28% support the strikes. In America, 59% disapprove of the military action, according to CNN. 60% say Trump doesn't have a clear plan. Only 27% think the US made enough diplomatic effort before using force. 54% think Iran will become more of a threat as a result, not less. Even among Republicans, only 54% want the strikes to continue. And yet the UK media is running wall-to-wall coverage designed to manufacture consent for exactly the thing the public overwhelmingly doesn't want. Sound familiar? It should, because they did the exact same thing in 2003. What James says that really sticks with me is this observation about Starmer walking a tightrope of unimaginable complexity. And I think that's right. He's getting attacked from one side for not doing enough to support Trump, and from the other side for doing too much by allowing defensive base use. And in reality, he's managed this about as well as anyone could given the circumstances. He's refused offensive action. He's demanded a legal basis. He's demanded a viable plan. And he's used a phrase that I think is going to become historically significant. This government does not believe in regime change from the skies. That is a direct repudiation of what the US and Israel are doing. That is Starmer drawing a line and saying Iraq taught us something and we're not doing it again. And James is right that this is Starmer the lawyer at his best, even if Starmer the politician has been struggling on pretty much everything else. But here's my concern, and this is where I go beyond what James covered. The defensive operations that Starmer has authorised are already putting British forces in harm's way. RAF Akrotiri has been struck. British personnel in Bahrain narrowly avoided casualties. The more defensive operations we run, the more likely it is that a British service member gets killed. And the moment that happens, the pressure to escalate becomes overwhelming. The tabloids will go berserk. The Tories will demand action. Farage will call it weakness. And suddenly that careful legal distinction between defensive and offensive operations starts to look a lot thinner. That's how these things work. You don't jump into a war. You slide into one dead soldier at a time, one defensive mission that goes wrong, one incident that gets reframed as an act of war requiring a full response. And before anyone voted on anything, before Parliament debated anything, you're in it. And then there's the deeper question that James raised through David Petraeus's famous line, "Tell me how this ends," because nobody can. Trump can't, Netanyahu can't, the Pentagon can't. The IRGC is announcing its most intense offensive operation in history. Iran has hit airports in Dubai, missile sites in Qatar, bases in Bahrain and Kuwait. There are protests erupting from Pakistan to Iraq to Lebanon. 3 American soldiers are already dead. 148 girls are dead in a school in Minab. And the man who started all of this is already on the phone to Axios talking about off-ramps while simultaneously telling CNBC everything is ahead of schedule. Ahead of schedule for what? What is the schedule? What is the plan? There isn't one. James says he's got 2 words written on the paper in front of him, Iraq and Trump. And honestly, those 2 words are all you need, because Iraq is the lesson and Trump is the reason we haven't learned it. Iraq taught us that you don't bomb a Middle Eastern country without a plan. Trump is a man who doesn't believe in plans. Iraq taught us that regime change from the air doesn't work. Trump is calling for regime change from the air. Iraq taught us that the media will manufacture consent for war and the public will regret it afterwards. The media is manufacturing consent for war right now, and the public is already against it before it's even properly started. So when you see the front pages tomorrow, and they will be screaming about weakness and hand-wringing and pearl-clutching, just remember that 58% of this country agrees with Starmer, not with them. Remember that the same newspapers calling for action now were calling for action in 2003. Remember how that went, and ask yourself the question that nobody in power seems willing to answer. Tell me how this ends. Because if nobody can tell you how it ends, maybe it shouldn't have started.